preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
This evening's lecture with Phillip Pearlstein marks the second event in this year's Artist Visions series. We've had a change in the schedule. Regretfully, Rachel White-Reed will not be with us on April 22nd, for those of you who were anticipating seeing her. Instead, Lisa Yuskavage will speak. The final lecture in the series will be Lorna Simpson on May 13th. The moderator for Artist Visions is, as always, Robert Storr. Mr. Storr is a curator in the Department of Painting and Sculpture at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Exhibitions he's curated for MoMA include last year's Chuck Close show, last summer's Tony Smith retrospective, and Willem de Kooning, The Late Paintings. Mr. Storr is the author of several monographs, including those on Philip Guston, Chuck Close, and Louise Bourgeois. He is currently working on a series of survey exhibitions for the modern and also a solo exhibition of the work of Gerhard Richter. The format for this evening will be, as always, Mr. Storr will come out and do an introduction to Mr. Pearlstein, and then Mr. Pearlstein will come out and show his slides. At the end of the slides, Mr. Storr and Mr. Pearlstein will have a conversation, and at the end of that there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions, and we encourage you to do so. So without any further ado, please help me to welcome Rob Storr. Thank you.
It's very hot light tonight. Just a word about the schedule changes. Rachel White-Reed is very sorry she cannot come, but she's been advised not to travel for the time being. And she has said that she will do it, that is to say, do the talk that she was going to do this spring, next spring. So we'll work her into the schedule, and she apologizes through me to you. And secondarily, that when we thought about people to invite in her stead, it occurred to me that it would be interesting to have Lisa Yuskavage, who has done an entirely different kind of figurative painting, in some proximity to our guest tonight, Phillip Pearlstein, because both of them deal with the conventions of figurative painting in ways that are extremely radical, and maybe the comparison, not a direct one, but an indirect one, would be good for the sort of total pattern of these talks. It's a particular pleasure to introduce Phillip Pearlstein tonight for many reasons. I've known him a long time, and I've known his work even longer. When I was first painting in art school, I started out basically making realist paintings without much awareness of what realist painting was going on in New York at that time. I came from Chicago. And as happens to artists, I found out that I was actually painting somebody else's work. And I was painting Philip's work, and he was doing it very much better than I did, as a result of which I started doing something else. But I've had an abiding interest in the work because the problems that it raises are problems which, on the one hand, seemed and remain very fundamental to the way I think about work, and about what it is that occurs in observation, what the facts of painting are, and the facts of painting can be things observed or the materials or the circumstances with which one works. But also because realism as a general proposition remains the fly in the ointment to an awful lot of theories of modernism. The person who's said this most clearly, and I dare say first, was Linda Nochlin, who is the great professor of art history at the Institute of Fine Arts, who wrote an article in 1971, actually two articles, entitled The Realist Criminal and the Abstract Law. It was written at a time when realism was still stigmatized as being reactionary art, and the idea that to paint from life and to paint from observation and to render the world as it appears to the eye was a pedestrian, anachronistic enterprise which was anti-modern in spirit. And she made a very nice distinction between realism as something that was non-avant garde and something that was anti-modernist. And more particularly, she hung it on this device. She said that in the 19th century, realism was essentially a radical practice because it denied idealism. It denied the idea that there was an ideal form, an abstract, a generalized form, which was of greater significance than the particulars of observation. and that indeed much of the work that is called realist is not realist at all. It is figurative, but it is more informed by conventions of taste and again of idealism, how things should turn out rather than how they are, than it is by this one-to-one exploratory empirical way of dealing with the world. And that in our time, abstraction had replaced academic representation, academic figuration, in which case realism was once again a radical critique of a lot of things that modernism took for granted. It's a modern art, but it is perhaps not an avant garde modernist art, and that this dynamic relationship between the world as one would like to imagine it, the world as averaged out of experience, and the world as represented by unique experience, embodied in it in a sort of essential tension. And this argument very much hung on what Phillip Pearlstein did, and on the fact that Phillip himself, coming out of art history, having studied at the Institute, had written about realism in a theoretical way as well. I think what he's going to do tonight is to pick up not only some of these threads, but really to talk about his relationship to a number of other avant-garde tendencies. So I'll leave it to him to do that, and then as usual, we'll have a bit of a conversation afterwards, the two of us, and we'll open it to the House. And for people who have not done this kind of session before, we really welcome questions. Don't worry about asking simple questions, and please, if you're going to ask complicated ones, make them concise. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to start by showing slides. How do we have the lights out, please? This is, could this spotlight be turned? Okay, thanks. This is a painting done within the last few years, and I guess it represents everything I've been trying to do. Well, first of all, it's 5 feet wide, 6 feet wide, 5 feet high, and which means the figure in the foreground is about 1.5 times life size, which introduces all kinds of optical problems. Everything that's closest to me, I stand about 4 feet away from the nearest point of the model, whether that's a foot or in this case a shoulder, and then I make visual measurements all over the place. So starting at one central point, here it would have been probably where that rod crosses her nose, the rod that holds up the dirigible. On the floor there's a Navajo rug, and then a collection of horses. One's from a rocking horse. The one that the model in the foreground has her right arm over is a classic American weather vane. And the one leaning against the wall in the back is a mechanical shooting target. And above them is a weather vane in the shape of, I think it represents the Hindenburg. And there's an electric outlet that has prominence, mostly because I don't want these to become, to be mistaken for surrealist visions or dreamlike situations. So I have the rods that hold up the Zeppelin and the black horse, the electrical conduit along the baseboard, and so forth, just to make it all measurable and of this world. It's in my studio. I think traditional realism had a lot to do with sociology and politics, and I've done my best to eliminate those Well, this is a painting I did in, it must have been during the 10th year in high school, 10th grade, because it won a prize when I was in the 11th grade and was reproduced in Life magazine in the spring of 1942, just as World War II was about to start. And I have it hanging in my studio, and one of the models in the previous painting commented on the fact that it looked so much alike. I really haven't gone all that far, except to the other side of the merry-go-round. And this was another painting also reproduced in on that same page in Life magazine. And in a funny way, I admit I haven't gone very far, but 1942 was a long time ago. Well, not so long after that, I was in the United States Army, in the infantry, and spent most of the time as an infantry replacement, training all the time to be a combat replacement. Fortunately, I never got to combat. But I did a lot of drawings and watercolors. The previous slide was of a drawing done during a lunch break at the foot of Monte Cassino, where I arrived after the big battles had all been fought. And from Monte Cassino, we were moved up to a place outside of Rome. The camps we were in were always called Repel Depel. Anyway, this scene is at the top of the Spanish stairs, and the little boy is trying to sell his sister to the two GIs. This was also outside of Rome. The watercolor was done later, after the war ended, but I made the sketch I started it while we were taking a break from a running, training problem. But those were graves of soldiers, American soldiers, who had been killed at that spot, not so much earlier. Because of those reproductions in Life magazine, I was assigned for a while to a graphic workshop where we did charts like this for training purposes. This is 4 feet high, and we silk screened them. And again, it has the look of something I would do now, and I'm quite startled by it. But working in that shop was my introduction to many things. I worked with men who had been commercial artists in civilian life, and they taught me about lettering and perspective and all that, and design. I spent several months in that workshop. At any rate, when the war ended, I spent because I'd never been in combat, I was in Italy almost a full year after the war ended, then finally got back to Carnegie Tech in Pittsburgh on the GI Bill, and where because of my experience in that workshop, I was made the art director of the Carnegie magazine, which was mostly it was for the School of Engineering. So this is an illustration of encephalography, electroencephalography. But it's interesting for a kind of its expressionist look, cubist expressionist look. And while I was doing heavy-handed, intellectualized things like that, my friend Andy Warhol, who was a classmate, was turning out things like this. Then we went to New York together, and he immediately became successful as an illustrator, and I went to work for a graphic designer, primarily working on catalogs of American standard sanitary equipment. So these are a bunch of shower units for institutions. But I was involved in everything, the overall layout, the counting of the type, the pay stubs, the drafting, and so on. But in the evening, I was developing paintings like this. This is one of those shower units, which looked to me like a skeleton, attacking a young girl who started off as an ink blot on my drafting table. But working for that, in that design studio was a great experience. The man's name was Ladislav Sutnar, and he really was one of the great graphic designers of the, at least the first half of the 20th century. And many of his friends were Bauhaus people who would, they'd all come to America as refugees during the war, and they would stop off and visit. And one of those men was Buckminster Fuller, who at the time was absolutely broke. He just come from Black Mountain College, and Sutnar, to help him out, got this company that did the big catalogs to have Fuller do a booklet on transportation in the next half century. This was the year 1949. And so I spent about 2 weeks with Fuller. He brought in this huge sheaf of plans, drawings of all sorts, and explained them to me in great detail, and I would have to make these very simplified stylized drawings. There were about 30 pages like this in the book. I thought this was most interesting because it looks that one on the right looks so much like the Stealth plane. At the same time, I was once I got involved in that kind of symbolism with the shower units, I decided all kinds of things were good symbols. This was from the cover of Strength and Health magazine, which I tore up, and the idea was that those little men were building the monument for World War III. It's probably as close to some kind of comment as I ever got. But that led directly to a painting of Superman, which was taken from the comic book, where he's keeping two missiles from colliding over New York City. But I picked this one because he's really in the position of Michelangelo's God separating day from night on the Sistine Chapel ceiling. Then I went on to paint the Statue of Liberty, and the American Eagle, and there was a Dick Tracy developing. When I heard about a co-op gallery being started by a group of younger artists, and I thought it was a great idea, and I invited them to come and look at my work. And they saw these paintings, like that shower painting and Superman and Statue of Liberty, and there was absolute silence. So I did something dumb. I painted over most of those paintings. I kept Superman because I liked it. But in the meantime, I had started studying at the Institute of Fine Arts because my boss, Ladislav Sutnar, said all American art students were badly educated, and I was no exception. And I had time on the GI Bill, and he thought I should study art history. And I got into the Institute, where I had no business being. I simply didn't have the academic background for it. But I managed to get through it, and when it came time to start on what was to be and what should have been a doctoral dissertation, I picked the work of Francis Picabia and his friend Marcel Duchamp because they also did paintings based on machine shapes taken from catalogs. So I felt very much at home with it. But the Institute was set up for the study of iconography. And so I did a real iconographical, if that's the term, study. I found this drawing by Picabia on the back of a menu. It's in the library of rare books or something at the New York Public Library. And on it, it says La Fille sans mère, which I translate as the machine born without a mother. I'm sorry, the daughter born without a mother, which I translated or further as being the machine. And that became the basis for a whole series of works, roughly from 1912 or 13 through the 1920s. This one is now in the Museum of Modern Art, and it's called I Fondly Remember My Dear Udine. That's my translation. But both he and Duchamp painted the titles of their paintings right on the front of the painting, or on the drawings. And so I realized it was some sort of word game, and I figured my French was probably as bad as their English, and I solved some of the word puzzles. This is Duchamp's parallel work. They both took that idea of a young woman, and everything they did for that 10-year period was based on the activities of this young woman. This is Duchamp's big painting on glass, the bride stripped bare by her bachelors even. I don't want to get involved in discussing their work at this point, but Picabia died in the middle of my thesis, and I was suddenly the world's leading expert in the English language, at least, on Francis Picabia. And I was asked to submit articles to a couple of magazines, and eventually it was published in the Arts magazine. It's called The Secret Language of Francis Picabia. About the same time, I had my first one-man show in that co-op gallery down on 10th Street. But I was now showing works like this, which were based on rocks, a collection of rocks that I picked up at Montauk Point. And I treated them as landscapes. Of course, I was highly influenced by de Kooning, Franz Klein, Philip Guston, and Cézanne. And classical Chinese landscape painting. I put it all together. This was a painting of a rock, or started from a painting of a rock, but I also saw it as kind of a mutilated torso. I guess it's the end of Superman. But it was picked for a show by it was picked by Clement Greenberg for a show called Emerging Talent, and it was reproduced in Arts Magazine. This was before I did the article for Arts Magazine. And Arts Magazine at that point was this very slender publication with all the reproductions ganged up in the middle. And this painting was reproduced large, and other famous artists' paintings showing at the same time were reproduced small. And years later, well, the next day, I got phone call from an uptown gallery inviting me to become part of the gallery. So years later, I met the man who had been editor and thanked him. And he said, I did that because I had just been fired and I was thumbing my nose at the New York art world. And I thought your painting was the ugliest I'd ever seen. But it was okay. Anyway, these are all from rocks. I did a series of paintings from that drawing of rocks, too. And I had a nice career of this kind of work. I usually started with doing watercolors or drawings, and would do oil paintings from them. The drawings and watercolors have really never been exhibited until recent years. I just put them away and forgot about them. And this is the oil painting based on the previous watercolor. For some reason, the oil paintings were much darker, heavier, and I threw away the luminosity that the watercolors had. Some of them are large. I think this one was 5 feet wide. The paintings became increasingly more naturalistic, more descriptive. This was done from a drawing of exposed tree roots, a fallen tree. And it was my first painting to enter a museum collection. It's in the Whitney somewhere. Another uprooted tree painting. Then I got a Fulbright, went back to Italy, and did a bunch of watercolors and drawings there to start things off. This was a view of Assisi. It's up there on that hillside. But I really spent most of that year making drawings of the Roman ruins, which had kind of a self-contained symbolism, dead civilization. Didn't have to worry about it. And I was looking for the kind of composition that I had learned about studying the abstract expressionists. The paintings were still highly expressionistic. It's about 5 feet high. Some of them look like piles of meat. I got carried away with red. I did a series of drawings along the Amalfi Coast of the cliffs and did paintings from them when I came back to New York. This is 8 feet wide. This is 8 feet high, but they became increasingly naturalistic. I realized that a lot of the color was highly symbolic or symbolistic and really didn't relate to the the naturalistic forms that I was more interested in. At that point, I was teaching at, I came back to New York and began teaching at Pratt Institute, and a group of the faculty there would meet once a week, Sunday evenings, invited to the studio of Mercedes Matter, who was also on the faculty there. And she would hire models and had all these gorgeous pieces of cloth, and just have them pose very casually. And we drew for about 6 hours straight. The models changing poses rather frequently. The group included people like George McNeil and Philip Guston, as well as a bunch of younger artists, Paul Georges, Lois Dodd, Mary Frank sometimes. Then I tried to do paintings from those drawings, and I didn't quite know where I was going with it. The first one was very thin, this one's very heavy in paint and expressionistic. Then I had the bright idea of hiring a model to pose for a painting. And this was one of the first. And everybody got upset because he was totally naked. But it got exhibited and we weren't arrested. This was at the Alan Frumkin Gallery. And the first paintings I painted as quickly as I could because I was so conscious of the money being spent. But I gradually spent more and more time on them. This is 6 feet wide. Six feet high. And roughly about this point in the about 1963 or 64 was the height of all the protest movements. And suddenly artists like myself, Alfred Leslie, a couple others, were suddenly seen as, well, I think the slogan, we were saying it like it is, or seeing it like it is, whatever that was. And they took on political overtones, which was not what I wanted. And they took on other overtones. This one was reproduced in a book written by a German art historian called Erotic Art Today. And he found those arrows on the carpet in conjunction with the naked lady very erotic. I also got involved in printmaking, and whereas before a lot of the paintings came after drawings or watercolor studies, for a long time they came after the prints. This was an aquatint etching, the painting that developed later. A lithograph. The print is 6 feet high. It's the oil painting. Then I would also play around with finding the view. So that's the same pose, but from another angle, and I made a large oil painting of this. And this is the painting. It's in the Berlin Museum of Modern Art, the State Museum. And I've heard that it's shown sometimes. And I got more and more complicated and began adding all this stuff, which I had collected, never thinking they would enter into the compositions. There are two mirrors there in the middle, and that's a fish that was used as a trade sign, and this dancing minstrel figure was also used as a sign to announce minstrel shows from about the 1850s. And that's the painting. The paintings almost became puzzles. I felt the viewer should work a little at trying to figure out what was going on. I got my reflection is in the mirror in the middle. Also finding the view, a composition. And when I look for the composition, it's really in terms of the most active kind of play of diagonals across the surface. It's the same setup. This is the drawing in charcoal on the canvas, which I think is 5 feet square. That carved lion is something somebody rescued from Luna Park, which burnt down in I think around 1900. Another setup. I very often have the feeling that maybe I should be exhibiting the setups. That's a kiddie car in the shape of an airplane and a beat-up model airplane. And that was the painting, my view. The detail. And I just love that cluster and clutter of shapes and trying to get it all organized and establishing the spatial relationships and different textures and so on. This is a photograph of the models in the setup. And you can see I work within 4 feet of them. This is the painting. This is another painting of the same subject. This is 7 feet square. Well, not quite square. And the idea of playing around with the one painting leading to another, I find fascinating. Of course, you can do it with a movie camera very easily. This was one painting completed, but I like the setup with the painting in it, and decided to do another painting of that, which became this. I've continued being interested in landscape. This was done in Israel, in Jerusalem, looking into the Kidron Valley. It's 10 feet wide. I worked on 2 pieces of watercolor paper, each one 5 feet wide. And I had them together the first couple of days, did the drawing, but I couldn't fight the wind. And so I ended up developing each half separately and then putting them back together again the last couple of days. The whole thing took 16 days. The Kidron Valley is the historically where the city of Jerusalem started. It was David's city. And it's under all these now Arab, what is an Arab neighborhood, which is built over all the old ruins. And the Mount of Olives is up at the top, and an Arab school in the foreground. I had my easel tied to the automobile. This was early in the morning, about 7 or 8. And then back home, I did color separations over the watercolor. There are 9 of them, like this, picking out the amount of each color in each area. And then these were transferred to wood blocks, the same size. And this is a wood block print, also 10 feet wide, done from 9 color blocks. It was done at the University of South Florida, Tampa's graphic workshop. Nope. There should be another tray of slides now. I hope. Is there anybody up there?
Yep, I think he's shifting them.
Oh.
I can see movement.
At any rate, I've enjoyed working on graphics. I've done an awful lot of them, but it's the technical process that fascinates me, and most of them have been complicated aquatint, multicolor aquatint prints, and this view of Jerusalem was the only woodblock print. Let's go back. That's a detail of the one section of the woodblock print. Then I thought I should do something similar with New York City. The slide is kind of funny. The camera got bumped, but it ends. The picture isn't cropped. It just ends at the left side of the slide. But I rented an apartment just to do several views of my neighborhood on the west side in the 30s. So this overlooks all the ramps and roadways to from the Port Authority and into the Lincoln Tunnel. There was a daytime view. This is a detail. It's interesting that a couple of the buildings in the foreground there are no longer there. New York City keeps changing so rapidly. Another painting done in that apartment, and with a view towards the Empire State Building, which was lit up. I think that's their Thanksgiving light, red and yellow. And I enjoy the fact that all those reflections take on kind of an Art Deco out of Cubist look. Well, this is a portrait I did of Erwin Panofsky, the great art historian, for his 100th anniversary, which was celebrated at Princeton's Institute for Advanced Studies, which was set up for Einstein and Panofsky. He was considered that important. And as I said earlier, he's the man who he demonstrated that that cultures can be interpreted through the art they produce, or vice versa, and which ultimately leads to the whole idea of political correctness and the study of, I understand a lot of current art history dispenses with the art altogether and concentrates on the culture. But I realized that he's the man I've been fighting all these years. The big problem of realism has to do with what the subject is. And once I decided that the models and those objects just add up to kind of a big still life, I felt I had dispensed with the problem. I'd never done a painting from a photograph, and Irving Lavin, who was the current head of the Institute for Advanced Studies, asked me to do this portrait because I had been in Panofsky's class, one of his classes. I said, I never worked from photographs. He said, it's about time you started. So I just projected it and then worked as if he were sitting there. About the same time started this painting of a male model posing with two minstrel marionettes. I took a lot of shots of that situation because the fellow thought he was going to do an article on the painting, but he never did. The minstrel marionettes are roughly 1850s, and they were carved in such a way that some people can place the tribe that the carver came from. They're very African looking in the faces. But they were done for the entertainment of the minstrels, not to, for the entertainment of the blacks, not to make fun of them. When I get the painting sketched out, I then go back over every area, always putting down a new fresh coat of a middle color to work into, and then work dark and light into that. Anyway, then when the painting was approaching completion, I took this shot of him posing against it, but I liked the look of that and decided to do a painting of him posing for the painting. This was the drawing. Well, just about this time, the riots in Los Angeles happened, and the painting suddenly assumed a kind of sociological meaning or implications that was both funny and disturbing. I decided to ignore them. But the smaller painting was taken for consideration for purchase by a museum, and of course it didn't pass the board of trustees, who thought that it projected the wrong image of blacks for the community, so it was returned. But I continued with the painting. I started the small painting over again and just left it go after the first session. here's the finished painting of the man posing in front of the painting. Of course, there's a big debt to Seurat's painting of the women posing against the Grand Jatte. This is the painting in the gallery with the fellow who's now grown a beard standing there. And another painting that looks like it should mean something but doesn't, with a figure of Punch on the ladder from the little fire engine and the head of Nefertiti in a plaster cast. And another variation on that with Punch and Nefertiti, breast, hand, and arm of chair. Maybe it just means that New York City is a big flea market, and I try to get as much of it into my studio as possible, including the models, who I don't think there's any other city where models are a part of the fact of the art world to the extent that they are here. And since most of my life has been spent in art schools, for me they are just part of the environment. A model posing with a marionette from Burma. And I don't know, I like the juxtaposition of the wooden hands with the real hand, but I don't know that there's any deep meaning to that. Some art historians suggested that maybe I see everybody as a puppet and I'm the puppeteer. Anyway, when this toy horse found its way onto that piano stool, it of course suggested Marcel Duchamp's bicycle wheel on a stool. So there is kind of a debt to Duchamp in this. But the wildest thing is that the late works of Picabia, which I didn't know at all, they weren't ever shown until recent years, turned out to be this sort of thing. He copied pictures from girly magazines, and very realistic. And there have been several shows of them recently. And in Paris, I ran into a situation where I had an exhibition, and I was introduced to a couple who very proudly told me they had just bought one of these. So suddenly I was faced with the fact that Picabia has become one of my competitors. Anyway, I wanted to show these slides of Sidney and Francis Lewis. I did a portrait of them about 20 years ago, I guess. Sidney just died this past week, but they were an amazing couple. They developed a huge company called Best Products, sort of like Kmart, around the country. And in every community where they built one of their stores, they would buy up the works of local artists that they liked, or else trade the artists with kitchen appliances, that sort of thing, for the works. But they supported and helped promote the artists in all those communities. Well, I started this, it's 7 feet wide, 5 feet high, with Sidney in the foreground. And I got that far with the painting when I decided he was going to be so huge, way, 3 times life size. And because of perspective, Francis was going to appear very small. without consulting them, I washed it out and started over. They were shocked when they came the next day, and we started over. This was the rough underpainting. And I'm sorry, the slides were all overexposed. Too much light on the canvas. But this was, I tried to follow the development of the heads. This is working over the underpainting. It's much paler than it because of the overlighting. This went on over a couple of days. That's the final, where the lighting is correct, the light on the canvas. The underpainting of Francis. And to my surprise, they liked all the wrinkles, the honesty of it. That's the final portrait. Okay. We have lights on, please. Good. Come over here.
I just wanted to ask a few brief questions since the talk was very thorough, and I think we should open it to the House pretty quickly. But one question has to do with your relationship to modernism as a way of making pictures as structures. I remember in the article that you wrote, realist pictures today are not made in heaven. A part of that, and this was done in about 1963 or 4, something like that, I forget. Right. Yeah, it was partly a polemic or an argument against the modernist idea coming out of Cézanne that to represent reality, you always have a moving vantage point, that the kind of space that Cézanne invented and that led to Cubism broke up the structure of the body, broke up the structure of deep space, and that you wanted to turn it back round and treat a painting much more the way the eye actually sees somebody directly across the room, which includes perhaps optical distortions that result from how the eye moves, but doesn't necessarily lead to a fractured picture plane. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that, and I'm specifically interested in the way that also relates to what I think, anyway, is the Mondrian lurking underneath a lot of those bodies.
Well, because of the graphic design work, especially at that level, it was a thorough indoctrination into not Mondrian as such, but you could see, that Mondrian was the man to study for layout, for graphic design. And I studied Mondrian. I wanted to do my dissertation on Mondrian, but Alan Capral had already grabbed Mondrian as a subject. That he was at Columbia, but somehow I couldn't compete. And I used to go to the museum and stare at the Mondrians, and strange things happen when you stare at them. You have to empty your mind and just look, and they start swimming around, especially the Broadway Boogie Woogie. All those little dots jump, and they become parts of patterns, and your eye jumps from one spot to the other. And I realized that there's a connection there to Cézanne, that especially if you study Cézanne's drawings, I see them as kind of maps of where his eyes looked, because every time you look up from making a mark on the paper, you look up and something else grabs your eye, some little spot that's brighter or darker or more colorful. And so his marks were sort of scattered around in approximate relationship. And then that kind of linked up with, all this happened at the same time, with my growing awareness of the paintings of the abstract expressionists. Franz Klein was developing his black and white, those big paintings just at that moment, and they were being shown. And the connections for me were so obvious. And then when it came to really researching Picabia, I realized he was a great one to study, because his, well, one thing you have to remember, not many art books were around in 1950, 51, 52. There were a bunch of little paperback books with bad reproductions, and Skira had just started publishing those great big fancy books. But there was very little on Picabia. The only thing in English that I was aware of was a book Robert Motherwell did on the Dada painters and poets. And so it was a wide open field for study. And I started with the fact that he was a prodigy, I guess. But when he was young, he was working as an impressionist and post-impressionist, at the right moment, at the historical time. And from there, he moves into early phases of Cubism. And then he invented his own kind of Cubism, which really was the second phase of Cubism, where it becomes flat rather than the first phase is all space out of Cézanne. The second phase, everything is flat. It's called synthetic, I don't know why. And from there he moved to futurism and invented Dada, and then moved and was one of the first of the surrealists. So it was a wonderful way of studying the whole first 20 years of modernism. And he wrote a lot. He wrote poetry, and he was a good friend of Ezra Pound. And they published a magazine together. And he was a good friend of Gertrude Stein. And it was just a wonderful way of getting involved in 20th century culture. But when I finished it, when I handed in the thesis, I realized that it had nothing to do with me. It was ended. I mean, my activity in that was ended, but it was a wonderful education. And at that point, I felt I knew everything there was to know about modernism. That may not have been true, but that's how I felt. And I began teaching, and I was given a course called, just the title of a course called A History of Art Workshop. So I had them take a photograph of people in an urban situation and take it through the whole history of art, stylistically. I had a year to do it in, and got terribly hung up with the Renaissance. I remember standing at the blackboard trying to describe first two-point perspective and then three-point perspective, and finally giving up and asking if any of the kids in the class knew how to do this. And suddenly it seemed like the most complicated, sophisticated, interesting thing to do, try to be realist. And I just...
Well, one of the things I was thinking in the back of my mind is there was an article written, I don't know, in the 60s by William Rubin at The Modern about Pollock, and said that Pollock represented the kind of artist who put together things that logically did not belong together in picture making as people had thought of it at that particular time. And it seems to me when you get to these late rhombus paintings with, you know, blimps going this way and limbs going that way, that you essentially have what you've just described plus Mondrian. You have deep space juxtaposed to armatures that keep bringing you back to the surface. And rather than doing it with bars and color blocks, you essentially do it with objects and limbs. But
Right.
you have, in fact, a very, very modernist picture space alloyed with a very, very pre-modernist, deep Baroque space. Was that a conscious intention, or was that a place you just landed?
It's more or less the result
Yeah.
of everything I've just described. I used that course as a laboratory. I gave problems to see what the students would come up with. And so I didn't have to do it myself, but I could use ideas from the best of them. Some of them later became terrific painters or art directors. I don't feel any guilt about that, but I did learn from them, from watching them struggle. But one of the problems I gave that I learned the most from was right when my friend Al Held was developing his first big paintings. And it talks about picture plane and fighting the picture plane and this and that. And he was doing things with rectangles that right around the edge made the picture plane kind of, I thought, fight for its life. And that's the way I presented it as a problem to the students. I had them do essentially an abstract painting. They didn't know Al Held's work at that point. And I had them make these and resolve them, fight the picture plane. And then to translate that into a still life, a realist still life. And that was a terrific problem, and I learned an awful lot from it. And it's simply a matter of taking ideas. Well, I see art as kind of a series of grammars. Art styles are simply different grammars, different kinds of languages. And you apply it in other situations to see what happens.
One thing you didn't talk very much about is response to your work. And certainly when you started making realist paintings, there was very, very little there weren't sort of constituencies waiting for realist paintings. Indeed, it was pretty much against the grain of what was going on in the mainstream art world. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the moment in the 60s when you began to put that work out in public, and then maybe sort of flash forward and talk about what you think either the acceptance or resistance to what I like to call sort of eyeball realist painting is in the present circumstance.
Well, when I first began exhibiting, again, you have to realize the art world, at least that part of it that I was involved with, was very small. It was easy to get to know people. You went to openings, and everybody was relaxed and friendly. And within a relatively brief time, you could have met everybody who was taking part, who was exhibiting, or hoping to exhibit. And the artists essentially developed in public. It was really like a sport. You watched, you waited for the next Klein painting to see what he would do, or de Kooning. And it was big news. You went and studied it. And there was a common language, visual language, built up that way. And I guess I was always regarded with some suspicion by some of the people, some of the artists, because I'd published, I wrote, and several articles published in a couple of years. And you could see that my paintings were implications of landscape, if not explicit. And so I wasn't quite trusted. But when I first showed the figure paintings, it was viewed by some people as a betrayal. I remember meeting Jack Tworkoff in the subway train after he saw my first show, and he wouldn't talk to me. Before that, he'd been asking me if I'd be interested in going up to Yale to teach summer school. And Thomas Hess wrote about my work as I was a double agent. And Lyndon Auckland wrote a very long article on my work, and Thomas Hess published it in Art News, but he gave it a new title, which was called The Ugly American. And when I complained, he said, "Well, that was Marlon Brando. What are you complaining about?"
Do you think the situation for realist painters is dramatically changed now? Do you think people have come to expect realism as a part of the overall discourse, or is it back off in a corner?
Yeah, I think there's a great deal of acceptance, but there are different kinds of realism, which is one of the things that was interesting. There was a group of students from the New York Studio School who, after the big artist, club ended, I guess sometime in the early 60s, they started their own Friday night meetings down at the Educational Alliance and invited everybody working with any kind of representationalism at all to come down. And it was amazing. They took off. Every Friday evening there'd be 200, sometimes 300 people packing into this large room to talk about figurative painting. And they got in violent arguments. Somebody summed it up as the heads versus the guts, the intellectuals versus the emotionalists. But they were quite nasty. They could be very nasty arguments. And remember, they invited Chuck Close down, but they decided they didn't like anybody who painted from photographs. So he had beer cans thrown at him. But it was amazing how many different points of view you could have about figure painting. And certainly, I would say Lucian Freud comes along and represents the guts. People seem to respond more favorably to the guts rather than to the intellects. They have an easier time dealing with it.
Well, let me just address the intellects, and then I'll open it to the House. But through very good fortune and generosity of several people, including Philip, we've acquired at the Modern 2 paintings. One recently, to say within the last year or so. One is the Superman painting, which I should point out for those who are art historically minded, antedates Warhol's Superman painting by 10 years. And the other one is the painting of the man with the marionettes. And both of those paintings really are iconographic paintings, and you have downplayed that, but I'm wondering to the degree to which you would confess to the fact that those paintings really are aimed in a way at shibboleths of modernism, but also shibboleths of postmodernism, and it's a way of including loaded imagery which plays back to postmodernist arguments, many of its own ideas about assumptions of representation, confusions between what seems to be simple fact and what in fact is heavily loaded symbolism.
Well, I mean, but there's more. Just painting a naked figure seems to bring up all these arguments as well. It's a loaded subject. People respond in all kinds of crazy ways to the human figure that's naked, and that's a hard one to deal with. I mean, our society is so split. One half the time we have a locker room mentality, the other half time is very prudish. And what you can find on the newsstands is so outlandish compared to what you see in the galleries and the museums. But as soon as contemporary painting of a nude is put in a museum, people get upset. So it isn't just the addition of the marionettes, it's the naked white man too, sitting there. But in my life, he's a given fact. Adding the marionettes, I knew would be problematic because I saw the way some friends of mine had reacted to those minstrel marionettes. They said they couldn't look at them because it represented something. They saw them as an insult to the blacks. In fact, there's a whole category of antiques that are devoted to that kind of, I forget what it's called. But I don't see them that way at all. I think they're wonderful works of art. And so I use them and decided not to worry about how people will react to them. I did not make a painting of them by themselves. I mean the marionettes. But maybe I will.
Well, maybe I'll write an article, which I've actually wanted to do, about you as a proto-postmodernist. But anyway, can I open it to the House? And if people could ask questions clearly enough so that the rest of the room can hear it, that would be very helpful. Don't be bashful. Yes, please.
Your props are so interesting and so unusual. Do you just choose them because of their shapes? I mean, you were just saying that you chose the marionettes because you see them as works of art. But what about all the horses and the blimp?
Well, the same things. As I say, I collected most of those things long before I ever thought of using them in paintings. Because I like them. And what I respond to is a kind of, they have to have a clear outline or contours, and they have to really look like what they're meant to look like, I guess stylistically pure in a way. The minstrel marionettes look like little people playing instruments. But you can see that they're controlled mechanically. They're not like, they're not lovable, huggable little stuffed animals. They have a personality, and I think the same is true of most of each of those horse representations that I've picked up have those characteristics as well, and you see different stylistic variations there. The Victorian hobby horse is quite different than that American weather vane horse, which is called the index horse for some reason. And that black horse in the painting, the shooting target horse, has a mechanical robot look I've only painted one stuffed doll, and that was a Popeye. It looks just like Popeye. But to get back to Superman as a, what did you call him?
An icon. I think, something
icon.
like that.
Well, he
Thank
is.
you.
He is. He's, for whatever sociological reasons, Superman, at least to earlier generations, had that character. I don't know, I guess it came out of ideas in World War II, but it also, he does coincide with a lot of Renaissance art. There's a point in late Renaissance art, especially in the Venetians, I guess it starts with Michelangelo, suddenly all the figures are up in the air, or most of them are flying around in the air. And I've never read an explanation, but there are all these heavyweight, big people floating around up there. And it's never bothered anybody. You know, at least Superman, the comic, had a reason for being up in the sky.
Great. Yes, please.
Sometime earlier in your conversation, you mentioned that you would not be adverse to people having opinions about the work that seem to be outside of your still life description. So I can't help but want to prod you into saying a little bit more, which you seem somewhat reluctant to do. I can't believe that some of these juxtapositions are just a visual still life for you. I think that, you know, some of the elements in your paintings are so extraordinary, particularly the juxtaposition of the skin with the marionette hand and so forth. I just wondered if you would be willing, since you said that you hope somebody might address that,
Well,
you ever address it yourself?
I had tried to address it once a long time ago in an article that I called Alone in the Jungle, which was actually written when I was in Guatemala in the jungle. But we live in a society that's so split. There's so many groups of people with different backgrounds that I don't see how an artist can really worry about what his work is going to mean, you know, across the board. You sort of pick an ideal audience in your mind, and that's usually a university class audience, and aim at that. But that's yourself, you know, myself.
You are hoping to provoke those conversations, be it in a university class or in the mind of the viewer?
No, I'm trying to make a painting that is interesting for me to look at. I am my audience. I can't be responsible for anybody else's reactions, because even with any one class, we all come from all over the country, different attitudes built in. There's no way of dealing with it. Art before our time was produced for homogeneous societies where an audience could predict more or less what the reaction would be. But even there, I've read that in that big book, a series of books on Michelangelo by, what's his name, de Tolnay, starts off by saying that if the ordinary man in the street in Rome had walked into the Sistine Chapel, and he would not have been allowed to be there, but if he had been able to walk in, he would not have understood what he was looking at. And I think that's what we're stuck with in our society, to a much greater degree.
There's one question over here. We should probably do just two more questions, and then I think the staff of the YMHA would like us to stop. But
Okay.
please, yeah.
Did you ever teach at the Art Students League, and if so, how long?
No, I didn't teach there, but when I was first applying for teaching jobs after I got a degree in art history, I received a letter from the man who was then the head of the school saying he would never hire an artist like me who had been so educated. It was a very discouraging letter.
Yes, over there, please.
I'm wondering how you chose your rocks and how you choose your models today, and is there any similarity in what your eye sees?
Yeah. Well, the rocks I chose for their visual interest. They were all on the beach of, on both sides of the end of Long Island there. And first of all, I was surprised by the great variety of rocks. I know nothing about geology, so I'm not trying to say that, but they were just, each rock was different when you really look at them. They're different kinds of stones, and I had no idea how they all end up in the same place. They didn't even relate to what was around the landscape around them. So I got interested in them that way, and I tried to pick ones that had the most interesting visual things going on in them. The models more or less choose me. They have been, over the years, they've been friends of friends. When models decide to stop working for me, they recommend friends. And that's the way it's been. It's harder to keep a male model working over a long period of time than it is women. I can't answer, I don't know why.
Okay, one last question, and then, yeah.
I was curious, maybe this is pushing the same point, but I'm curious whether or not you have an internal narrative when you construct these paintings that you end up with. Do you have an internal narrative to begin with, or does the structure come out of the painting itself?
If there's a narrative, it has more to do with how I go through a museum or a flea market, which I think is the same thing as going through a museum. I look for things that interest me, and because I have these things in the studio, I've become used to them, and they become like characters, but there's no real interaction. They all, they represent something out there like Superman. They reflect something about our culture, but I can't go beyond that. I can't really pinpoint. My final use of them is purely visual. I know when my paintings are carried out on the sidewalk. I live in the garment district. There's always a group of men standing around pushing, or those carts or unloading trucks. And I know they get a kick out of looking at the paintings, but for the wrong reasons that have nothing to do with my aims. And that's what I mean about, we live in a society where you can't control people's reactions.
Well, I'd like to end on the sort of Dadaist note that it occurs to me then that I'm working at a flea circus rather than at a museum. Anyway, thank you very much for coming, and thank you, Philip.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.